Hey, welcome back to Mike Seibert Radio. I am your host, and today, as we continue to celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the 35th anniversary of the Transformers the movie, we're going to talk about a very special presentation that happened a couple weeks ago during TFNation in the United Kingdom back on August 13th and 14th, called Beyond Your Wildest Imagination. Transformers historian Jim Sorenson and YouTuber Chris McFeely, they hosted a live multimedia presentation of the long-lost original very first draft of the script for Transformers the movie, written, of course, by Ron Friedman. I recently was a guest on Autopod Decepticast, where we talked about a lot of the outline of the script and all of, like, this thing has taken Transformers fandom by storm, as soon as we met Rails and all these other cool things, but I'm getting ahead of myself.
Didn't they recently go through the second draft that Ron had done?
So my buddies for Autopod Decepticast, I believe it's the 1985 script. I don't remember what number it is in sequence.
When I say second draft, it probably isn't literally, probably the version I did had a couple of different drafts as he went through it. But in terms of the major life cycle of the film, what I did at TFNation with Chris, that was effectively the first draft. It was the first vision of the Transformers the movie, and then that 1985 draft, that was very much the second one, made in response to the memo that Hasbro and Marvel and guys like Flint had sent to Ron, requesting some specific revisions. And that's where you get to guys like Bolts and Cubby and the Anabots and those guys.
So, some of the more familiar things for those of us that have consumed what we thought was the original Ron Friedman script of Transformers the movie. But today we're going to go beyond your wildest imagination. And my guest, as you've already seen, beyond your wildest imagination.
We're going beyond your wildest imagination.
Okay. There it is. See, there.
It works for me.
Yeah, you're picking up on what I put down. I love it. Jim
Sorenson, sure you didn't stutter,
right? Of which I do often. But
so do I.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join me today. I'm really excited to talk about the fact that 36 years later, we're still finding new things and new ways to celebrate Transformers the movie. How are you doing this morning?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here, and thanks for letting me do it a day later. I wound up getting busier yesterday. I run a book club here in Albuquerque, and I moderate the discussion. So I really wanted to get to the end of the book. So I needed this time, and I wasn't sure how long it would run. I've heard sometimes these things go as long as like 4 hours.
He's checked out my show, ladies and gentlemen. That's awesome. As I mentioned before in the intro, at TFNation a few weeks ago, you and Chris McFeely give this incredibly brilliant multimedia presentation with slides and audio.
Presentation is underselling it. It was an extravaganza.
It
was, because we had obviously, when you put Chris and I on the stage, we've been friends forever. We have a pretty good chemistry and a good energy, and we both reread the script. We'd read the script several times, and I think I had read it on my journey from the States over to the United Kingdom. So I'm in the airplane going through the a printout of the script that my wife made for me, and I believe Chris had a similar sort of refresh of it. So it was very top of mind for us, all of the details. And I picked up things on that. I think it was about my third read that I hadn't picked up the first or second time, because it's dense. There's a lot going on. For people who don't know, Ron Friedman, who did the first couple of drafts of the Transformers the movie, and he had done all the dialogue editing on Transformers season 1, so all the characters had consistent voices, and they'll talk, you Deceptive Turkey, and they wouldn't say steel, they'd say rubidium steel alloy, those sort of things. That was Ron. But Ron also was known. Hasbro had brought Ron in. He was a well-known TV writer, and they had brought him in to try and give extra credibility to their cartoon efforts, and he wound up writing the first few G.I. Joe 5-parters. Mm-hmm. And if I assume there's a lot of crossover on your audience, those G.I. Joe 5-parters, when they're trying to deal with the Weather Dominator or the Mass Device or the Pyramid of Darkness, and they're bouncing all over the planet, and the teams are getting split up and their objectives get fragmented, and then they come together in the climax. And a lot of those elements wind up in the final version of the Transformers, the movie, but they're especially prevalent here in this first draft. You can kind of see Ron's mind on display, open. You can see that creative process and draw some of those parallels up to and including the idea of having different terrains. You know, in the final version of the film, it manifests itself more as a planet hopping adventure. And I think that's a pretty good choice in that, you know, even by season 2, Transformers had done a little bit of galaxy spawning. Certainly there's Earth and Cybertron, but they go to other planets from time to time in episodes like the God Gambit or the Gambler. So seeing that in the final version of the movie is pretty interesting, but having it, you know, in this version, there's also a little bit of that on Earth as they go to little refugee camps, and they have a battle in the desert, and then they go to an Arctic stronghold where the last Autobot ship is. So all of that stuff is pretty interesting to see. And I like drawing those connections in terms of seeing how a writer thinks and works and processes and gets their ideas down onto the page.
Absolutely. And, you know, you really unlock something, Jim, in that, like, that feels very much like early G.I. Joe. And it also feels like early season 1, like, you know, like the whole power plant of the week type of thing, how the adventure kicks off. But I think we're getting way ahead of ourselves, and I'm very excited to talk about all of this stuff, very obviously. But before we get too much further, because, you know, folks may have seen this stunning profile of Jim Sorenson and his hat at TF Cons or being prolific in the fandom, but since every live stream or every podcast might be somebody's first podcast, you know, obviously you've had a lot of experience as a Transformers historian and a fan and an archivist, and what I would say, like, someone who has kind of made that leap from fandom to official work and then back and forth and back again. But for folks that might not have met you before, who is Jim Sorenson to Transformers fandom? And tell us a little bit about yourself before we get even further on the rails about the.
Okay. You don't want to go into the weeds. I like your use of the words rails. So
yeah,
I assume that was intentional. So I've been a fan of Transformers since 1984. I was right in the target demographic group. I saw that commercial for Marvel Comics Transformers, and I thought it was great. And I asked my mom to go out and buy me an Optimus Prime, and we went driving all around town and we couldn't find one. So I got Prowl instead, because I figured, well, I mean, I guess a police car is okay. It's not as good as a truck, but it was something that I very much appreciated as an 8-year-old on that level, you know, on that level of taking 2 action figures and smashing them together, or taking cars and having them race. But it stuck with me. And I think a lot of that comes down to the comics, especially the Simon Furman comics when he took over in the US. You know, I thought his take was pretty interesting and mature. You know, obviously by the time I was 8 in 1984, so I was older when Simon Furman took over writing the comics. But you know, they sort of aged up with me, and I liked those stories. And then they came back in Transformers Generation 2, both in the comics and in the toys. My folks were very excited because Transformers had been off the shelves for a couple of years, and they came back, and they got me a bunch of Transformers under the Christmas tree again, which was really pretty cool. And you know, and there was not so much access to the internet. I certainly didn't have it at the time. So it was all sort of word of mouth. You would hear at the comic book store that Transformers were showing up in G.I. Joe. And then I'd be like, oh, let me check. And then you can't because it's polybagged. And you're like, I have to buy this issue of G.I. Joe, sight unseen because I heard there might be Transformers in it. And then there are. So you're like, yay,
Yep.
okay, that gamble has paid off. But, it was an exciting time. And I went to college. I got access to the internet. I became involved in the Transformers fandom. And one of the first things I did as a fan that had official crossover was I was really interested in fonts, and I would make fonts for different sci-fi franchises. And I made one for The Last Starfighter, and I did one for Predator that's actually gotten official use too. And I made a bunch for Transformers, many of which have gone on to become the official or an official Transformers font that's been used in ARGs and in packaging and in comics. So all of that was pretty exciting for me. But my first published work came in 2007 because I had collected a bunch of Transformers animation model sheets, and I thought they were really cool. And I wanted to share them with an audience. And I was ambitious, and I thought I could put them up on the web, but I'd rather do it in print. And I was able to convince IDW that, yeah, let's do a 200-page book of black and white 25-year-old designs. So, and God bless them, because it doesn't sound now to me, it doesn't sound very commercial, but it sold well enough to justify a second volume. And then I got to do it for Transformers Animated, which was really cool because unlike working with the G1 where I'm splunking through Bob Budiansky's basement on Thanksgiving. This time I could just drive. I lived in LA at the time, so I could just drive to Burbank and walk into Cartoon Network with a portable hard drive, and they'd say, "What do you want?" I'll say, "I want all your animation models." And they say, "Okay, do you want anything else?" I'm like, "Yeah, give me all your scripts." "Okay, do you want anything else?" "Yeah, give me all your backgrounds." Anything else? Like, "Yeah, give me all your storyboards." Give more. So I didn't have to worry about acquisition. I got it all done in an afternoon, and it really freed up time for me and my collaborator Bill Forster to expand the scope of the project and make it a lot more creative and interesting rather than just images on a page, which I think is a fine scope for a project, but animated was the kind of thing where I could go further, and I had the blessings of guys like Matt Youngberg and Marty Eisenberg and Derek Wyatt to go farther. So we did happily, and audiences responded to that. And then, I've done another half dozen books since then. And it's really neat and interesting, and it's sort of auto-generating. The more work you do, the easier it is to do more work. And that's not just in terms of things like credibility with publishers. They know I can hit my deadline and I'm not going to embarrass them, et cetera, et cetera. But also in terms of acquiring new assets. When I'm working on something like Animated or The Art of Prime, it's easy because I'm working with people on a show that's currently in production. But when I'm working like the presentation we did at TFNation, that's stuff that is very, very old, and it can be really hard to find. Hasbro, generally speaking, doesn't have much of this stuff in their archive. So you're going to fans, you're going to creators, and you're rifling through their basements and their garages and their closets. And when you're lucky, you find these sort of things. And I believe it was 2009. It was a couple of years after my first book had come out. At one of the BotCons, I went up to Flint Dilley after a panel, and I introduced myself, and I told him I was very interested in going through his archives because I'd love to try and find some of these old model sheets and et cetera. And he said, yes, I have a bunch of that stuff. I'm a pack rat. And in principle, I'm willing to let you go through it. In practice, it's in a storage unit and it's buried, and it's not something I'm going to get to anytime soon. So I kind of kept up with him, and I tried to thread that needle of like reminding him who I was, but not pestering. So I think I wound up sending him an email about every year and a half. And whenever we were at a con together, I would reintroduce myself. And he always is a smart guy, and he always remembered me. And he said, yes, I'm in principle willing to do this. Logistically, we're not there yet, until eventually he did go through his storage unit and pull it all out and decide that he was going to keep some and throw up the rest on eBay.
Yeah.
And And that was my moment. And he was gracious enough to let me come out. And I wound up, I've described it, and it's just a slight gloss on what actually happened. I've described it as me being in Flint's garage. I was actually in John Platten's garage, because that's where Flint's, who's a good friend and collaborator of Flint's and a nice guy, and has his own really interesting projects that you should check out. But John was more eBay savvy than Flint, and wound up, that was sort of the staging area. So it was actually JZP's garage, and I'm going through. And as I said at the con, it was on election day. It was about a 4-day period, and one of them was election day. And I'm going through all the stuff, and I knew that he had this draft script, and I got permission to scan it and archive it. But we also wanted to let the buyer have access to the script exclusively for a period of time. And I'm friends with the buyer as well. So I worked with Flint and the buyer in terms of the timing and the manner of the release. And I think everybody is on board with the idea of eventually releasing a full PDF, but they were more comfortable with a summary first. And frankly, I think a summary is in some ways a more interesting way to meet and encounter this material for the first time. I think Chris and I have enough credibility and goodwill that nobody's too worried that we're misrepresenting things. And when it eventually comes out, hopefully people will read and share that conclusion. But beyond that, these are dense scripts. It's a 220-page script. We're missing a few pages, and a few of them are condensed, but it's a lot of material to go through and to make sense of. And you've done, or you've been on podcasts recently where they've done some of that work for later drafts. So I think you have a sense as to what I'm talking about. If you just throw it up online, people will read a page or two. Most people will read a page or two and turn out, and then somebody will write up a summary, and that summary will wind up on Twitter, and then that's how people will get introduced to it anyway. So we thought we would maybe take a little bit more control over the narrative, really highlight what we thought was interesting about the differences and why some of the differences occurred, and literally illustrate some of the new characters and scenes.
Mm-hmm.
And all of that artwork, I believe, is available as well on the various artists page and on Twitter, usually with my face and Chris's face at the bottom image, which isn't maybe the ideal way to meet the image, but it really fuels my ego, so I can appreciate that too. But that's sort of who I am, and I probably answered about 3 of your other questions as well. That's why I was in the position to be scanning that and going through it, and why we chose to release it in that way. So I guess interview over, right?
Yeah. And that will wrap it up for this week's episode. Thank you so much for joining us. Follow Jim on Twitter. That's an excellent distillation. And I think you already touched on it a bit, that, both you and Chris are terrific at summarizing and distilling and condensing things down, because having tried to read that earlier Ron Friedman draft, it's intimidating. It's dense, as you had said. And so I think some of the discourse that I've seen in Twitter following the popularity of the new art pieces, the characters, and all of the cool stuff that's gone into this project, I saw a couple folks saying, like, gosh, this seems better than the movie we got, which I think at the time it kind of rankled me, but I think in the time since I've cooled off, it's just like, no, we're appreciating the shock of the new, because like it's, again, it's, these characters and situations are things we never knew existed, and there's an excitement there to where it's like, oh my gosh, there was this trained snake thing. There was, Cup was going to be like a Sherman tank. Like there are concepts there that are inherently exciting that I think folks just kind of grab onto. Like, I don't know if you've seen like some of the fan art that's come out. Like, folks have taken like
I've seen a little bit of Rails fan art, which I thought was really, I mean, I'm not surprised exactly, but it's cool to see so quickly people putting their own creativity and spin on some of these ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I want to see Starscream interlocked with some other Decepticon. You know?
Not me.
I'm interlocked with lesser mechanisms. I mean, or tying up the train like a pretzel. I mean, all that stuff is good. Ron has a real knack for grabbing memorable imagery from his mind and putting it on the page and then eventually up onto the screen. And to your point, I've seen people saying that it's much worse than what we got, and it's completely incoherent. And I don't think either position is fair or accurate. I think what this draft is it's different. It's reflecting, in many ways, a different sensibility than what Hasbro really wanted. And
right.
I've reiterated this before, but I want to say this again. It's very much a first draft. And even if Hasbro had loved every single plot point, there would inevitably be a second draft, a polished draft that would go through and tighten up certain scenes and get the action a little bit crisper, get the dialogue a little bit crisper. Like, no first draft survives all the way to the end. And things like the lack of payoff or the silver dollar, that would be caught and addressed either by removing the plot or adding whatever the payoff was. And obviously Ron had some sort of idea in mind. I doubt he remembers it at this point. It wouldn't shock me. He's a really smart guy, or maybe he could reverse engineer it. But it didn't happen, maybe because of deadlines, or it got rushed, or he just forgot. But that sort of thing would definitely get addressed. So to the extent that there are bits of the plot that are incoherent, that would surely have been addressed. And to the extent that there are some really exciting new ideas, everything sounds great on the page, but would they have done Rails? Did they have the technology to make a new toy? Clearly Hasbro was willing to invest money in making brand new toys, things like Galvatron, Cobbler, Hot Rod, Almost RC, Scourge, and Rekgar, and Springer, and the Sweeps. Like, these ideas came most likely from Ron's imagination, and then eventually, from Flint's imagination, right? What these characters were like, and what their visuals would be, and what their personalities would be. But Hasbro was willing to put engineering resources behind bringing some of these ideas to life. But they also wanted to do it within a certain scope, right? There were a few of them, like Galvatron, are in a size category by themselves, but Hot Rod, Cup, Blur, they were within the existing Autobot cars category. And the reason for the shift from tanker to Cup was so that the Autobots could all, or mostly, be cars. Rekgar and Rodimus Prime are a little bit bigger. Springer is a triple changer, but it's likewise, Scourge and Cyclonus, they wanted to fit into the assortment of Decepticon jets, which means they had to be a certain size. They had a certain imagery and look to them. So, it was unclear in the script exactly what the sweeps would be. We had talked about maybe doing them as like a German, limousine sort of type car. But ultimately we decided to kind of keep the image of what they had, because it was ambiguous in the script, and definitely the direction that Hasbro would have to go would be, to make them as jet-like as possible.
Right.
So yeah, I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I agree with you, and I see how that could be a frustration in terms of people's reaction, but it's a pretty understandable one too.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, do we know if Ron had any kind of direction from Hasbro about anything? Or like, is this just something he just completely sprang from his imagination over a weekend?
We don't. Well, it was several months he was working on it, because
Sure.
we have dates for things like initial outlines versus the the when the script gets completed. But we don't really know what Ron was given. That hasn't shown up yet in paperwork or documentation. He has said, in his book, that Hasbro had mandated that he killed Optimus Prime, and that feels accurate. It's sensible towards what Hasbro's goals of the movie are, which is helping to transition to a new leader character, a new main character for the line. And I have to assume the idea of killing off Megatron was probably also something that they had asked for, that maybe even the name Galvatron had come from Hasbro, but we don't know that for sure. And it's possible that the name Ultra Magnus had come from Hasbro, but again, we don't know that for sure. The fact that there's concept art for Ultra Magnus that's not based on the Diaclone powered Convoy toy makes me think that there was, at some point in the design process, the idea that this might be one of those new toys that Hasbro is willing to design. So we just don't know. And at this point, it's very difficult even to trust the recollections of the people involved, because there were 3 major drafts of the movie, and there were memos that were going back and forth and requests that were being made. One of the changes from the first draft to the second draft that was specifically requested in the memo was that they not kill the new characters, and there was a list of characters they were allowed to kill. That list had proved slightly vexing or confusing to us when we didn't know the context of the memo, wondering, oh, we're allowed to, but it makes more sense now. It's saying, oh, well, you don't kill Blur and and Mentlar. If you're gonna kill someone, kill Prowl and Ironhide and Ratchet, right, and Brawn. Like these guys are the fair game.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So at this point, so you've been in contact with Flint. He's discovered the script. He's sold it to a collector. That collector gives you guys blessing to share a summarization of that script. How does it then become the extravaganza of TFNation? Like, when does Chris get involved? When do the artists get involved? How does that evolve into what folks saw on that August weekend?
Well, so in 2019, TFNation, for their big Saturday night extravaganza, worked with Marty Eisenberg to bring an outline of, a detailed outline of what would have been Transformers Animated Season 4 to life as an extended script reading that had almost all of the original actors back and new artwork. And it was a huge success, and everyone loved it. And, there was an upcharge for the Saturday night, and that was a business model that they wanted to keep going forward. So TFNation needed to have some kind of extravaganza, to use my word. They needed a big event for their welcome back. And Dave Wallace, who's one of the organizers, came to me and said, what do you have for me? And I said, well, I have something really pretty interesting, but it's bigger than a, Friday evening panel of the hardcore fans, but I don't know if it rises quite to the level of a Saturday evening extravaganza. And I tell him what I have. And he says, oh, yes, it does. It does. But with the right level of investment. So that was all David, really, his vision of let's bring it to life with, and we brainstormed a little bit, would it make sense as a comic? Would it make sense as a script reading? But, we ultimately settled on the format that we had because it's a movie, right? I mean, if you wanted to tell the whole story, you really did need about 2 hours, and we weren't going to have 2 hours of, we theoretically could have had 2 hours of script reading, but it would have been expensive, and we would have not been able to get too many of the original voice actors. And this format seemed like something that was a pretty good compromise. It was within our budget. It was within the amount of time we had. And they pulled together the art team. And Chris and I and David went through the script sort of page by page in a very sort of cursory way, but page by page, kind of going through. And we decided on what we thought were the real highlights in terms of something that would be a standout visual image. That's something you could do. Early on, we had talked about maybe doing some animatics. And that was something that we wound up not having time for. So it was mostly still images. We had the original ones. We had Ed's really amazing new character models. And in my opinion, he really is channeling that fluoro dairy energy and feel. It feels like something that could have leapt from his imagination. And that's not, that was what he was working for. And that was what we were getting reference for. Rails in particular was one that it took us a while to get right and went through a couple of drafts. And one of the things that I was able to do, I'm not an artist, but I went through every bit of fluoro dairy art that I had looking for snakes, both mechanical and organic. And I sent all of it to Ed. So he had a sense. And that he told me that was something that was helpful to him in order to try and get that sense of what a mechanical snake, as imagined by fluoro dairy, might look like. And then Chris McFeely took some of those animation models and dropped them into familiar settings when appropriate, like the Planet of Junk or Quintessa. So we were able to get a few extra designs and images up on the screen, because it can be intimidating when you're up on the screen and it's just you and your voice and a partner going through this stuff. It's inherently interesting, and it's an audience that's primed, no pun intended, to be interested in the material. But it's helpful to have those things to look at while we're describing them to aid in the imagination, because some of the stuff's really trippy, and then other stuff I can act out. Most of the stuff I think is online now, and I had particular fun acting out the Magnus hero moment minutes into the movie where he's catching fireballs in a giant steel bucket and hurling them back at it. So I'm up on stage acting that out in front of a live audience, and that's something that I probably wouldn't have done in a different venue, but right. When you have hundreds of people that are sort of cheering and oohing and ahhing and applauding, it's easy to get into that rhythm and not worry that you're embarrassing yourself or anything to the effect of that. And it is such a great moment that that's the kind of thing that would have made a terrific animatic if we had the time. So this was the next best thing that I could do.
Yeah. Well, and I would say that the word I would use to describe what the extravaganza was and what you guys put together is approachable. It took a dense material, summarized it, condensed it, but then more importantly, broke it up in a way that's palatable for an audience to gravitate to. And I think that's part of the reason why we've seen so many of these images and these situations go so viral. I think this is why Transformers Twitter is so a Twitter about it, because it's like, we could grab those screen grabs, or we can grab for the thumbnail for this interview, I found a still of you acting out in the script. And I thought that was like a perfect distillation of the fun that was presented in that evening.
And it really was fun. It was fun being on that stage. Everyone who's voiced an opinion that I've heard or read has said it was really fun being in that audience. It was a real lightning in a bottle moment of Transformers fandom. And it's great that 500 or 600 people were able to experience it. And it was a real honor and privilege to be part of. And I'm glad that it's finding its way out into the wider international Transformers fandom. Fun is the perfect word. It was just great.
But I would also say, though, it kind of creates a little bit of FOMO for TF Nation. You know, it's like those of us that were here in the States, and we're like, we're getting this in like bits and spurts of like just what our friends are tweeting as it's happening in the audience. And for me, like, was one of my first exposures to it was I don't remember if it was either Galvatron sawing open Magnus and taking the Optimus Prime Matrix out, or if it was Megatron's spirit leaving his body. But either way, it was like, you know, it's like, oh man, this Ron Friedman stuff is so bonkers. And there was a part of me, and I don't know if this is just my Transformers content creator privilege or whatever, but I was like, I'm familiar with that stuff already. That's not new. I don't understand. And then I saw Rails, and I was like, oh, this what? And then I saw Tanker. Then I but I saw it like all disjointed and all out of order. And it wasn't until Chris did his more comprehensive summarization, which was spectacular. I don't know how much time he dedicated into threading all those tweets together, but that's another thing that's been essential for us that didn't have the opportunity to experience it. But even then, for folks that did experience it, like, you know, you ever been to a concert and like, you know, you talk to your friends, it's like, oh yeah, I remember this. Oh, I don't remember that. Oh yeah, well, this happened. And, you know, there's something about a live experience that kind of makes your memories funny, but also gives you a good community experience to talk about and experience.
Well, and that's some of the joy of the fandom, is that it is in fact a community, and it is people who have this shared passion and interest getting to experience new things and old things in new ways and old things with new context. You know, it's watching the Transformers the movie in a theater with other Transformers fans is different than watching it on your couch for the 17th time. Mm-hmm. And conventions are a good way to do that. And I will say that TF Nation is one of the absolute best that I've ever been to. The organizers are wonderful people and very inclusive and make such a welcoming environment. There's so many hugs. There's so many drinks being bought for other people. And it's just terrific. And that's not to put down other Transformers cons. There are lots of really good ones. You don't have to fly internationally to do a great TF. I mean, I know that TFCon in Chicago is coming up, and Ron Friedman is going to be there. So you can, you know, if you happen to be fortunate enough to be able to attend that one, you'll maybe can get his take on some of this stuff. And that guy, I saw him at the TFCon in Burbank earlier this year, and that is a sharp guy, good public speaker. You know, you can see how he could talk his way into getting some of these gigs, and he just anybody who's ever attended a Transformers convention, there's that moment where the audience is given the opportunity to ask questions, and sometimes they're great, and then sometimes you get one that's like a little cringe, and he's got this rare gift of being able to take one of those cringe questions and then spin it into gold without ignoring it. Not in that like sort of politician way of, well, where do you stand on X issue? Well, let me answer this by telling you about how I feel about Y issue that I'm on the right side of history on. You know, like he doesn't do that. He actually does engage with the question, but while turning it into something genuinely interesting and fascinating. And he is a real master bullshitter. I love that. So if you are going to TFCon in Chicago, I mean, it's a great opportunity to have that live shared experience and engage with some of the creators.
Absolutely. One of my favorite TFCon memories was in Toronto in 2019, and it was a back-to-back rock block. It was Ron Friedman by himself telling all of his great stories, but then Bob Budiansky right after. So to get that is like a rock power hour was a really good bit of spinning yarns and Transformers history. That was
absolutely.
That was a ton of
fun. And Bob was one of the guys who really helped give me my start, because the first book I did was largely based on a comic books Bible that I got, and it provided a pretty good foundation, but it was going to Bob's house again on Thanksgiving weekend. And that was because he lived in New York and I was visiting my folks in New York for Thanksgiving. So while I was out there, I wound up driving to his house, not on Thanksgiving Day, but on the Wednesday and Friday bracketing Thanksgiving, and going to his basement. And he had company, relatives, I assume, over, and I'm patrolling the basement, with the scanner going through and digitizing his archive. But a lot of that wound up in Transformers: The Ark and The Ark Volume 2. So I'm very great, and he wrote the foreword to the book. So it was great to be able to work with him, and he's always entertaining to see as well. And he did I think he did the TFNation in 2019 as well.
I believe so. That's my understanding. So speaking of Ron Friedman, I wanted to come back to something that a Facebook user posted in chat. Says, quote, I'm kind of on the outside of this, so this might have been mentioned already, but has Ron been aware of this project, and has he given his blessing as well? Do we know if Ron has been exposed to any of this?
Well, I did reach out to Ron, as did Chris. We wanted to interview him for the project. We were thinking maybe that would be something that we could use as a like a lead into it, maybe, or maybe because we did another panel. We did 3 panels Saturday night where we walked everybody through this with the artwork. But then on Sunday we did a lot more sedate. It needed to be because our voices were dead. Panel where Chris and I were seated and walked through some of the process of it and some of the less plotty details of the script that we thought were worth highlighting. And that would have been a good time to bring out some of the Ron Friedman stuff. So Ron was aware that we were doing it. It wasn't something, the timing, unfortunately, never really worked out.
Sure.
So I don't want to say he gave us his explicit blessings. I don't think that was necessarily something we had sought out. But he also didn't say, "Oh, you're doing a first draft of the Transformers the movie well, over my dead," like that. Yeah. That wasn't his attitude either. He seemed, in principle, happy to participate. But he's a busy guy, and I don't begrudge him his time.
Absolutely. And while we're here talking about folks in chat, my dude Alex, who was participating in that podcast I was telling you about at the top, where we talked about the entire presentation extravaganza for like 4 hours, but he writes he's watching on YouTube. The artwork really hit that Toei feel. Hats off. It really felt like genuine stills.
Oh, cheers. So, that's was very much the goal, and that's not on me, right? I mean, that's the work that the artists, that's the work that Ed and James and Andrew and everybody else who was working on that, they were able to do that through blood, sweat, and tears.
Yeah. Absolutely. And again, like we've already said a couple times, but I think that's it's the art and the summarization that's really making this crystallize for the fandom. I think that's why it's resonating with folks so much. Now, so we had talked about this before we started, before we went live here, and we talked on Twitter a bit as well. One of my recent favorite presentations you've done was with Flint Dilley.
That's a good one.
Yeah, back in Burbank.
Back in March,
back in March of this year, and it was kind of like the secrets of the 5 Faces of Darkness, where you showed some of the things from the original scripts and some storyboards and things like that. And I'm not sure if you've been aware of this or not, but Flint comes to TF cons often, and he'll get like a Friday night spot, and I think it was in Chicago in 2018 if memory serves, but I've more than a couple times I've sat in a panel room where Flint will just turn on the DVD and he'll just talk about 5 Faces, kind of very not quite Mystery Science Theater 3000-esque, but he would stop it, tell stories. Incredible, very fun.
Yeah, I've been in the audience for some of those, and I did TF Expo in Kansas City, Missouri, and he did that for the first episode or two, and I got to participate a little bit as well, because that was after the panel we had done. But the TFCon panel that again very much came out of me going through his documentation and reading the scripts and the outlines and the memoranda around the Five Faces of Darkness to try and understand why certain choices were made. And there were a lot of little things. Five Faces is one of those things where it's a very ambitious story that Flint has set out to tell, and the ACOM animation doesn't really live up to it. And it wound up presumably going a little short because they had these very, very long episode recaps. But then you had a lot of lines where a line gets cut off and it kind of changes the meaning of a sentence, or else just makes it nonsensical, right? Motor Master saying, the Autobots used to have a great leader. And it's just such a strange thing for him to say. And it's because the next line that gets cut off is, what was his transform again? Sort of getting in a subtle for Motor Master way. Oh, maybe trucks make good leaders, but that doesn't play because it got cut out completely. But the big thing there was Shockwave in the role that Blitzwing eventually had, and a much more natural fit. And makes little things like, the Shockwave was supposed to remember because he's the oldest Decepticon. So they tried to play that up. So there's a scene where Galvatron lands and puts his hand on Blitzwing's back, and Blitzwing sort of wobbles. And, I guess the most charitable read based on what's on the screen is, maybe he's low on energy because he didn't take the Quintesson energy. But what they were trying to convey was that this is an old guy who's unsteady on his feet. But Blitzwing doesn't come across as old because he's one of the newer characters. So it's vestigial, right? It's left over from what it would have been Shockwave. But I love the idea of that being that role going to Shockwave. That just seems so sensible to me. It's such a good use of the character as we've seen him.
Well, and especially when you get to how that plays out, where Blitzwing is essentially exiled from the Decepticons. Now, imagine for, cartoon Shockwave, who is fiercely loyal to Megatron. Cybertron will remain as you leave it. And
I think you took that a little bit too seriously, right?
Yes.
So some public works and improvement programs, a little infrastructure might
infrastructure.
I don't think Megatron would have been mad if he came back and Cybertron was full of cannons and guns and energy factories, It's like nothing has changed. I didn't actually tell you to do that. That was you.
But imagine if, like, the end of that dynamic, the end of that relationship is you're now shunned, and that just has so much dramatic weight. If that's
had they been allowed to use the character, surely there would have been a showcase episode. And instead, not only is it Blitzwing, but then very awkwardly, the role of the exiled Triple Changer is shunted over to Octane anyway. And clearly, like even as a kid, you're kind of picking up on, wait, I thought it was Blitzwing who got, like, why is Octane swiping Trypticon? What's going on there? So it became awkward. It became even more awkward than it really needed to be. I realized they wanted to showcase Octane more than Blitzwing because he was a newer character, but Blitzwing was still on toy shelves, and maybe they didn't want to give him 3 showcase episodes, but yeah, it's an unfortunate situation. But then so much around Five Faces of Darkness is, right? Because if that had been a Toei animated project, it would have, I think people appreciate Five Faces of Darkness, but I think they do it in that sort of slightly bonkers way. The word you used earlier to describe Friedman's script, they appreciate it for being a bit off the wall rather than for the potential vision that it had that a slightly better animation studio might have been able to deliver, and more judicious editing in terms of having all the lines make sense. It's a missed opportunity, and I know it's one that Flint himself would love to go back and revisit.
That's something he's said on pretty much every podcast he's ever been on, including my own. He's like, I'd really like to take another crack at Five Faces with contemporary animation, new everything, but just take another crack at it because
throwing that out into the universe. Ron is also working on a next chapter to a Transformers the movie as well. There's something about this era that really it acts like a black hole for the imagination, right? It's hard to get away from the weight of it. I mean, even back in the 80s, Furman in the UK, took this movie and made it so central to the comic book plot. It's really pretty fascinating to see.
It's interesting. Like my buddy Anthony Bricali from TFU.info often refers to Transformers the movie as the centerpiece of G1, because in so many ways, whether it's comic books or the cartoon, so much springs from that, and so much is it's just so much of an influential piece that, had the ambition of that movie not been there, what would it have been like any other 80s property? Would it have just been more of the same? Would it have been like Rainbow Bright the movie, or maybe even like the He-Man movie, where it's just like, or even G.I. Joe the movie to a much lesser extent, but to where it's just basically like more of the same extended episodes. I've said
even the Simpsons movie, right, where they specifically lampoon that sort of idea with Homer pointing to the camera saying, you could have watched this for free at home. I mean, it's a hard trap to get away from, I think, especially in animation, although even live action, right? I mean, the first X-Files movie sort of had criticisms of that, and things like the first Star Trek, the motion picture, worked really hard to try and break out of that by, its very ambitious cinematography. And I think where Transformers the movie, I don't want to say that it saved the franchise or anything. I think the franchise was very, very healthy in the 80s, and the kind of property that is well poised to weather multiple iterations. And in fact, if anything saved Transformers, it was Beast Wars being very successful and also very different, which allowed them the creative freedom of the reboot in a way that, G.I. Joe hasn't had a dramatically successful reboot since 1982, right? Since they moved to Real American Hero from the 12-inch dolls. So I think you can overstate the importance of Transformers, the movie, but calling it the centerpiece of the 80s is pretty reasonable. And I think one of the things it does that is creatively extremely successful is the time jump, because it blows open the possibilities of what Transformers animated storytelling was. I mean, there's a memo that Flint authored regarding season 2 about things he's tired of, and he's tired of deserts, and he's tired of people in hard hats and whatnot. I mean, fair enough. There's a lot of that in season 1, and it was the correct creative decision at the time. But season 3, on the back of the movie, goes much further in terms of expanding the scope of Transformers stories. It makes Cybertron a much more viable setting for their stories. It gives Earth those possibilities that a near future offer, and it made it more intergalactic, and the movie helped with that, or Interstellar, I guess. The movie certainly helped with that, and then Five Faces of Darkness very much takes the baton that the movie is passing and runs with it, with planets like Athenia and Char and Thrall, and revisiting Quintessa and revisiting Junk and going to Goo. I mean, it is a galaxy spanning adventure, as is Transformers the movie, and sets the tone for the rest of the season, for the next 25 episodes that we wind up getting. And even works its way backwards into the comic books, at least in the UK, and eventually into the US, by having time travel as an option, so that Furman can bring these characters from the year 2006 for whatever reason back to the present day of 1986, and let them have their adventures. Let Galvatron muck up with the guys back on Earth, and let Skids be floating in the void with a parasite on his head. Right,
exactly. Well, and I think the thing that we're also saying here is that it turns Transformers from a simple boys cartoon to sell toys into a true sci-fi powerhouse and makes it into a science fiction property going hard into sci-fi tropes and concepts, more so than just robots in disguise. It kind of outgrew robots in disguise to become what we...
That's an interesting point. I mean, and I think the sci-fi elements are present in earlier seasons, although they go maybe harder in season 3. Certainly in the setting, they go harder in a sci-fi setting. Most of the episodes of season 1 and 2 are in fact set on Earth. But sorry, what was the other thing you said? I had a point and then I lost it.
Oh, hard sci-fi. Basically, that Transformers is kind of as much a sci-fi property as it is a vehicle to sell toys.
Yeah. Oh no, it was outgrowing robots.
Outgrowing robots in disguise. That's right. That's right.
That was what I wanted to address, because I think you're starting to see that as early as season 2. Right? When it's like, it's not enough that they turn into a car or a dinosaur, right? Now we're going to really start combining. I guess that's an element from the end of season 1, but certainly by the time you get to season 4 and beyond, the year 4 of the toy line, you never just have transforming robots, or it's very rare that's what you have, right? Now they're going to have heads that pop off, or guns that turn into robots, or they're going to wear human or monster suits, or they're going to they're gonna not transform, but their companions are going to transform, or their vehicles are going to transform. So the idea that it needs to do more than just transform is something that I don't think can necessarily be traced to the Transformers the movie, but certainly is something that Hasbro was cognizant of in their toy lines. They didn't want to just keep revisiting realistic vehicles turning into robots, and also probably they didn't have the engineering capability of doing that, right? I mean, their first efforts of toys, it wouldn't surprise me. I don't know this as a fact, but it wouldn't surprise me if the reason ultimately for the time jump in the Transformers the movie was to justify having more futuristic cars, because I don't think they would have had the engineering know-how to produce brand new realistic looking cars the way that the Diaclone cars or the Microman household objects could do. So, instead they almost were locked into doing something a little bit blockier, a little bit more plasticky. And you can justify that by saying, oh, this is a Cybertronian car, or this is a future car, right? They don't have to look exactly like real cars, as long as they have 4 wheels and the right silhouette.
And you don't have to pay for licensing.
Well, there's that too, right?
Economics.
So, ultimately, right, it's a toy line. It's there to make money. Economics is always a factor.
Absolutely. So a couple things in chat I wanted to come back to as we get ready to think about wind down and closing out. Jim, you've been very generous with your time. This has been a whole lot of fun. But so Alex says, so this is a scoop, and it's fascinating that there is still material left uncovered. What does Jim hope is next, or even left to discover from G1?
Well, Secrets of Cybertron would be certainly Flint's holy grail. And I think based on his position in the fandom, there's a lot of people that would very much like to see that. And, it's not among his papers, but that doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So we do have tentative plans about how to go about looking for it. And hopefully someday that we could bring that out. But in terms of, there's always more to find, right? There's a story I like to tell that when Batman the Animated Series first came out and first had a toy line in the 90s, the first wave did not have a Joker figure. And I went to Bill Forster. I went to a buddy of mine, and we're like, how is there not a Joker? And we made a top 10 list of Batman the Animated figures that we want to see made. And of course, on the top of the list was the Joker. And of course, he was in wave 2. Well, how could he not be? But we always kept up our top 10 list of Batman animated figures we'd like to see. And as the universe expanded into Superman, the animated series, and then Justice League, and then Justice League Unlimited, we always kept our top 10 list. And you could always come up with 10 figures that you'd want that hadn't been made yet, because there's always more. There's always more. And for the longest time, Speedy was on there. And he was part of the very, very, very last wave of JLU figures to come out. And so he got bumped up. And so he didn't get to stay there. But, when the line closed out, we'd still had a top 10 list. And there were characters on there like Mercy Graves and Harvey Bullock, like not top tier figures, but you could always come up with 10 figures that if they made, I would buy. And so there's always more, right? Your Holy Grail is always the thing that you want the most that you haven't bought yet, because you already have 50 different Holy Grails that you've already managed to find. And this script would have been one of them. So I'd love to find more of the memoranda that were sent back and forth about, what projects should include, like that sort of stuff, especially around the Transformers, the movie, because there were so many hands involved in it. So knowing, with dates, who was asking for what and when, that stuff is really interesting. I think we have all the major drafts of the Transformers, the movie. There is an outline for the Transformers, the movie, for this draft that would have preceded it. That would be interesting to see. I don't think it's anybody's Holy Grail, but there probably would be interesting bits in there. Dark Glass, the unproduced script from Beast Wars, that's one that I'd love to see. And, for me, I'm such a model sheet guy. We're still missing model sheets for incidental characters from almost all of season 1 and for a lot of season 3. Five Faces of Darkness, we've only had a handful of the model sheets for the incidental models. So I'd love to find some of those. And, some of these still show up from time to time. They come out of Japan, or they come out of, Flint's basement or storage unit, and they come out of filing cabinets that were thrown away. I mean, you find these things in the darndest places. Sometimes Hasbro digs them up and then they have them. So, there's always more. I'm always looking. One of the nice things about doing shows and podcasts and books is that sometimes somebody who has this in their basement that they bought on eBay or at a convention 30 years ago, 15 years ago, says, "Oh, I think I might have that." And they get in touch and they email and the next thing you know, you're doing a panel in front of 500 people.
And it's something very similar to that just happened with the Transformers animated shorts. It's like, those aren't out. Here you go. It just and that just happened on Twitter, within the last week or so.
Yeah, no, I remember that. That was fun because that was one of those things where when I was working on the Allspark Almanac, they gave me a disc of it, but it's watermarked with my name on it and whatnot. So I've seen all of them. That's how I was able to write about them. There's little summaries of them, but there's no substitute for being able to actually watch that. So it's fantastic that somebody who had it and was in a position to share it was able to do so. And I'm so happy to see that sort of material come to light and not get lost. Because some of it does get lost, and some of it may never be found, but hopefully most of it will get found, will get shared, will make its way out into the consciousness, and then we can discuss it, and we can marvel at its wonders and gasp at its flaws. These things are they're so interesting because they're not perfect, because they have warts. You want to see that, right? The Transformers, the movie, even the version we got is a weird project, with weird pacing and this strange passing of the torch because of toys that would not make it into a conventional movie structure. It's not a Pixar movie. It has no ambition of being a Pixar movie. But that's part of what makes it great. Its soundtrack, its cast, it's not just in terms of the characters, but in terms of the actors. Orson Welles and Leonard Nimoy and Robert Stack. I mean, it's a star-studded cast that nobody turned out to see at the time.
Right. Well, and it's not any one thing. It's all of it. It's all of those disparate elements that combined make Transformers the movie something very special and iconic.
It's Weird Al Yankovic, and it's Ron Friedman and Flint Dille and Peter Cullen and Flora Derry, and all of these elements, as you say, Nelson Shin's directing. It is a very
use of color and just the palette
of it.
Yeah. It's everything. So I did want to loop back around briefly to Secret of Cybertron, because like something that I'm not sure I know or understand, especially now that we've seen this first Ron Friedman script. So what basically happened? Did like Flint Dille go to one corner and write Secret of Cybertron, and then Ron Friedman went to a different corner and wrote what this draft was? I don't know if we know.
It's not exactly clear what 100% what the timing is, but what seems to have happened was Ron turned this in, and the folks at the Marvel Productions, like Flint, read it and said, "Oh, I don't know if this is at all what we're interested in." And then Flint went into his corner with his writing partner, and they banged out Secrets of Cybertron in one, to hear him tell it in like one very memorable, caffeine fueled weekend. And who knows, right? I mean, that's he definitely produced something, and possibly thinking, well, maybe they're going to want to look in house to do the next draft, but ultimately Ron was contractually allowed, like it's still his name on the movie, because that's the deal, that's the contract that they signed. So they came up with what they thought would get the movie to sort of roughly where it needs to be, and then Ron did. Based on the memo that was sent to him. That's the neat part, is that we can read what he read, and what prompted him to turn the draft that we went through at TFNation with Rails and Tanker and whatnot into something that's much, much closer to what we finally got. Mm-hmm. The second draft, the draft that you went through, the 85 draft, that is recognizably the Transformers, the movie. It has, all the right characters, all the right scenes, and all the right order. The details vary, but Ron, as a professional, produced a script that was very much the movie they wanted. And then, at that point, that script was given to Flint, and Flint did the last pass and turned it into what was ultimately the shooting script and mm-hmm. wound up getting filmed. So that seems to be more or less the order. And then I'm sure that a lot of the ideas of the Secret of Cybertron wended their way into the Five Faces of Darkness, because that was informing, like less epic, right? And there would have been, Five Faces of Darkness had certain goals and certain things it needed to do that the movie did not. This is setting up the season of Transformers season 3. So Five Faces of Darkness is very much, setting out the game board for people to play on, and putting all the pieces in play. Whereas, a movie has more freedom, right? In terms of knocking all the pieces off the board. So I imagine that, but I feel like some of the big picture ideas, wound up, almost certainly wound up in Five Faces of Darkness. And it's been so long since Flint's read it or seen it. I mean, I'm sure it was 10 years before he even thought about it again, if not longer. Right. I don't think it was, one of the laments of his life at the time. Right. He wrote a script for a movie. They didn't wind up using it. He filed it away, and, and they gave him the third season to run. And he did his Five Faces of Darkness. I think that was probably more top of mind for him for quite a while. And obviously still is, and with good reason. But yeah, I'd be very curious to read it, because I don't think anyone could trust their recollection of what they wrote in a sleepless, caffeine induced haze 40 years ago.
Right.
And it's I certainly couldn't.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I could barely remember things 20 years ago, I was a younger man.
On TFNation, and that was 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks
exactly.
ago.
Exactly. So, a couple other questions for you. We talked, so some of the things that's fascinating about that original script from Ron Friedman, or I'm sorry, that first draft that you guys presented at TFNation, is that some of the stuff that ended up in the final movie. Like, like the fight between Optimus and Megatron is more or less the same as we see in the final film. So it's fascinating to see some of those, some concepts that do carry all the way over. So my question for you, based on some of the things we've already discussed, is there anything from the first draft that you guys presented that you would have liked to have seen carry over into the final movie?
Well, one of the things that the first draft does well, that it takes care to do, is set out, why Unicron exists and why things happen, at the time they happen. The idea that the Junkions are on Unicron's moon and ultimately built the Unicron, those are interesting ideas. I don't know if I'd say I specifically would have wanted to see them in the final film, because the final film being ambiguous about his origin, gives you things like Primacron and the Primus origin in the comics, and the so I hesitate to say it would have been better, but I appreciate from a writer's perspective that more dots maybe were connected in this version of the script than in what we finally got. And it's not quite the question that you asked, but especially the second draft of the script, the one that you went through recently. Mm-hmm. They had a subplot with Blaster on Earth and a sort of resistance movement.
Yeah. That's a lot of guerrilla warfare. Yeah.
Of the elements in this. That's not a huge element in this plot, but it is present. Not Blaster, but that sort of resistance movement of people left behind and what they're doing. And I think that might have been more satisfying than Blaster sort of just vanishing into the ether. I don't think you would have needed necessarily a lot of time spent with it, but even a little bit of time might have helped keep the stakes. The other thing that they did well is make the stakes of the movie Earth rather than Cybertron. Here Cybertron gets destroyed at the end of what we call Act 1. As I kind of alluded, it's not a neat 3-act structure. It might map more easily onto a 5-act structure, but it's clearly that's not something that Ron was too worried about. But at the end of what we called Act 1, Cybertron gets destroyed, and then Earth is the stakes. And I think making Earth the stakes is a pretty natural choice, a pretty natural creative choice, and that might have worked better as well. But I could see not wanting, on the flip side, making the stake Cybertron. I think there's a real sense that maybe he will destroy Cybertron, right? He already wrecked a couple of its moons, right? So maybe Cyber. I think part of you in the audience is always like, well, obviously they're not going to destroy Earth. I mean, sometimes that bites you in the butt. You're watching Macross and like, oh shit, they did destroy Earth. Okay, wasn't expecting that. Wasn't expecting that 2/3 of the way through a series, but right. It's not even the climax, right? It's like, oh yeah, we have a bunch more episodes after this, but usually you're like, okay, Earth would probably be fine. But Cybertron, realistically, yeah, I guess he could have destroyed it.
Yeah, the establishment of stakes is something that's really cool that is added to these later stories. I saw Alex posted in the chat. Why does Transformers tap into the psyche that other 80s toys show did not? What's the magic formula? I'm not sure I 100% agree with that, but
with the premise of the question. I mean, if you're a giant Masters of the Universe guy, then clearly that one is working for you. I do think Transformers can owe its longevity to a couple of factors. One of them I already alluded to is Beast Wars, giving them the freedom to reboot and appeal to the next generation and allow themselves to, and the Transformers fandom being willing to do that, which I think is largely because Beast Wars was so good, I mean, Beast Wars had plenty of resistance in the 90s when it first came out from the old guard, but it was just so consistently well written and well executed that we almost had no choice but to come along. And then once you've done it once, it's so much easier to do it the second time. But then the other thing is the basic play pattern of Transformers translates really well to a variety of media. The idea of, I mean, G.I. Joe is at its core toy soldiers, which means if you're not leaning into the toy side of things, they're just soldiers. And then you're making more movies, and you're making more movies about ninjas who have pet wolves and sailors with pirates. And, it's a little bit ridiculous. It has its charm, but, there are a million more movies out there. What makes G.I. Joe special? Whereas not so many properties really are about the transforming robots. The idea that an everyday object could in fact be an alien good guy or bad guy is a pretty powerful storytelling tool. And you can see it used by people like Michael Bay in a live action setting. And you can see it done in Beast Wars with animals. And you can see it done, they can be sci-fi spaceships that are turning. It works well as crossovers, right? Because so many properties have an iconic vehicle. You can turn the Enterprise into a robot. You could turn the Ecto-1 into a robot, right? You could turn the X-Men's Learjet into a robot, right?
Yeah.
You could turn Doc Brown's Time Machine into a robot, and it just sort of works. So I think the core premise is really, really strong. Not just as a toy, but also as a storytelling device.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, Jim, this has been an absolute blast. It's been cool going beyond your wildest imagination and learning more about that extravaganza that you guys put on at TFNation. Are you planning on going to TFCon in Chicago coming up in October?
I think I haven't ironed out all the details. I think there's a pretty good chance I'll be there.
Cool. So yeah, before we part ways for now, where can folks learn more about you on the internet, and how can we keep up with you on the social medias?
Well, I mean, I'm on Twitter at Jim Sorenson. So I know it's hard. SORENSON. You could find me on Facebook, although you're going to get more of my politics and photos of my 8-year-old if you do that. Those are probably the main places to find me these days. So I have a blog, but it's not really updated. A buddy of mine's been posting book reviews there. So
cool. Well, and my buddy Aaron posted in the chat a bit ago. He's jealous of your aesthetic. He wishes he could pull off a hat like yours. He's also going to be at TFCon.
Yeah. If I am at TFCon, just look for the guy in the hat. Say hi. I'm pretty friendly, and I'm usually more than happy to chat about this if I'm not on the way to a panel or the restroom or something.
Gotcha.
But like normally you saw me in the hall. I'm like, yeah, great. But then every once in a while, it's like, yeah, I really want to pee, so I'm gonna zip.
Well, yeah, I mean, especially if you're hanging out at a table with somebody or something like that. Yeah, if you're getting up for a reason. But my friends have a habit of talking to folks either coming out of or going into restrooms.
Coming out of is the way to do it. So as long as you're not in the restroom. Peter David tells a story about someone slipping him a manual under the stall of a restroom and doing what came naturally with it. So, but he's got a way with words. He should.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's Peter David after all. That's awesome. Well, any final thoughts or reflections about Transformers the movie or the extravaganza or anything about the future? Anything left uncrossed before we let you go?
Well, just that I love doing. The Transformers conventions. I love doing the Transformers books. So, if this is something that you're passionate about and you have questions or comments, reach out to me, especially at a con. If you can get yourself to TFCon or TF Nation or TFNation. There's tons of Transformers cons you can go to. If you can get yourself to a con, do it. Hang out with some like-minded people. If I'm there, hang out with me. And do reach out on social media if you have questions, if you have comments, if you have an idea, if you have material that you want to share, please reach out if you have material you want to share. So this is more than a career. This is a hobby and a passion, and I hope to be doing this for a long time and digging out new stuff and creating new stuff, and and hopefully the audience is still there for it.
Absolutely. Well, Jim, thanks again for taking the time to join me today. This is an absolute blast. We will have to do it again
for sure.
Sometime in the future.
We'll go beyond our wildest imagination.
You joke about that, but I did a presentation at a local Transformers convention here in the Seattle area called Cybfest Northwest, and I kind of like built on talking about Transformers the movie. First, it was like the legacy of the Transformers the movie. Then it was the return of the legacy of the Transformers the movie, and then I think I did like another one that was like the legacy of the return of the legacy of. I got real deep into that.
You got deep into the weeds. So next you can go beyond the return of the legacy of the return of the Transformers the movie's legacy.
There it is. I love it. Well,
we can keep going until words have no words. Time. Yeah, these concepts have eluded us. They have flown away, birds on a wing.
Well, and everything has an anniversary. It's like we're celebrating.
Oh yeah, especially if you do 5s and then 10s. It's like, yeah, they're going to keep rolling around with startling regularity.
I think so. I mean, like I have so much 35th anniversary branded Transformers the movie stuff that I'm still getting, and now that we're at the 1 year anniversary of that means we're only 4.
I don't think you can have a 1 year anniversary of a 35th anniversary. That's not a thing. That's a hill that Magnus will die on.
There it is. Perfect way to close out, Jim. Thank you so much again for taking the time to join us. We appreciate it. All right, and that will wrap things up for this episode. Thank you so much for listening and for hanging out with me and Jim. And if you want to listen to my podcast, Mike Seibert Radio, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, or wherever the heck else you listen to your podcasts. Like, share, rate, and review the show. Let us know what you'd like and what you'd like to hear more of in the future. For my guest, Jim Sorenson, my name is Mike. This has been Mike Seibert Radio. And until next time, tell all our one, make good choices.
Bye, guys.
Yeah, we did it. All right, so I'm going to end the live